Chapter 8, Field Operations, Part 2. In this particular PowerPoint presentation, we're going to look at some specific patrol initiatives, and they're really directed patrol initiatives, so they're really more focused. They're not general patrol. They really are more specific responses to problems. And so one of the really big areas, and no pun intended, but one of the really hot styles of policing is hotspots policing. And so what hotspots policing is based on is the idea that if we look at crime and look at crime data across a city, we're going to find that it isn't evenly spread across a city or a town or a county or whatever the jurisdiction is. That we often find that specific locations can have or will have a disproportionate amount of offenses and other kinds of problems occurring there. So, if for State College, for instance, College Avenue and Beaver Avenue, the two main downtown streets, are going to be hotspots because that's where the most people are, probably on a Friday or Saturday night. And so if you're going to send out your police officers to patrol on a Friday or Saturday night, you'd probably concentrate them in that area and not worry about some of the more quiet residential areas. Well, hotspots policing is based on that idea that don't just disperse police officers into general patrol and hope that they're going to come up with something. Be smarter about crime. Send the police officers to where the crimes are occurring. So send them to the hotspots. It may just be a particular address even. Maybe it's a bar that if we're going to have a problem on a Friday night, it's going to be at that bar. And so maybe in your hometown, you know of bars like this. That some bars never have a problem. They never have a fight. They never have cause any worries for the police. But other bars have had a reputation forever, and if there's going to be a fight, if there's going to be some other kind of problem, it's going to occur at that bar. So those are the ones that need the greater attention. So hotspots policing is really about, let's send the police officers to those hotspots and patrol those more heavily. So you can see, as I've written here, concentrate policing at these hotspots. So maybe you have foot patrols, you have more mobile patrols, whatever it may be. But you can send more officers there. We're going to see that it's more than just saturating the area with officers. It's also doing some other things. So what are some of the keys to success that now that we've been dealing with hotspots policing for a few decades, we've learned some things. What helps to make hotspots policing more effective? One of the most important things is to really keep that hotspot small. So don't define your hotspot as the entire neighborhood, because then it's really not a hotspot. It's probably too big. Or your entire beat. So an officer who has a beat might have several city blocks. Well, that's not really hotspots policing. If you say, well, the whole beat is my hotspot, you probably want to concentrate it even more. And so the smaller you can make that hotspot, the more effective you're likely to be. So if you can really narrow it down to this is, these addresses, these locations, if this particular crime is going to occur, it's most likely to occur here. You may even be able to define it by time as well. This particular crime is going to occur at 2 o'clock at night. If we're going to have drunk driving, it's going to be on this road, and it's most likely going to occur at these hours of the night. At 10 o'clock in the morning, probably not. But 1:30, 2 o'clock, 2:30 in the morning on a Friday night, a Saturday night, yeah, that's maybe a higher likelihood. So again, try to define it as much as possible. If this is sounding like problem-oriented policing, this is a kind of problem-oriented policing in some sense. You're really trying to analyze a problem and understand it. And to be able to do that, you need to have reliable data. And so that's the other key to success. So keep your hotspots small. Really concentrate on a specific problem. Don't try to cover all crimes. Really focus on specific crimes, specific locations, specific times, those things. And then secondly, make sure that your data is good, that you're using to define this hotspot. If you're relying on really shoddy data that isn't very reliable, it's garbage in, garbage out. You're probably not going to do a decent job when it comes to actually responding to the problem. As I said, if this sounds like problem-oriented policing, we have found that in study after study that if we pair hotspot policing with a problem-oriented policing approach, this is when we really become effective in reducing crime, reducing other problems. The problem, as we'll see, not just with hotspots policing or as we move on to these proactive arrests and crackdowns, is sustaining that hotspots policing and not leaving it too early so that the problem comes back. So we have to be committed to it until the problem really is abolished or reduced sufficiently where we can kind of maintain it with an ordinary style of patrol. When we see that same kind of problem and concern with other kinds of proactive arrests and crackdowns. So your book defines a crackdown as an intensive, short-term increase in officer presence and arrest for specific types of offenses or for all offenses in specific areas. So it could be a crackdown where you have kind of like hotspots policing, basically, similar kind of thing, maybe the same thing in some situations, where you have a lot of officers who are present to arrest for specific type of offenses. So we have a crackdown on specific offenses. So that's not tied to a hotspot. That may be citywide. We may say, okay, all officers throughout our entire city, we want you to crack down on drunk driving. We're not going to define where the hotspot occurs. So this can be distinct from hotspots policing. So we're not looking for particular locations. We're just saying when you see a drunk driver, we want you to deal with it. When you have domestic violence, we are now instituting a mandatory arrest policy. So that can be the kind of crackdown. Or we're really going to crack down on any kind of heroin possession or gun possession or whatever it might be. Or it could be more the hotspots type policing. That could be a form of crackdown, where this is the second part of that definition of crackdown, which is officers heavily present for all offenses in specific areas. So now maybe you are really cracking down in a specific city block. So again, this isn't truly hotspots policing. It may look like it, but you're saying in this particular neighborhood, we are going to saturate this neighborhood with officers. So remember that hotspots policing really said we're most likely looking for specific crimes at specific locations. Here we may be saying on this particular block, we are going to saturate with more officers than necessary, and we're going to look for all offenses, whatever they may be. We're going to crack down on this particular neighborhood. What we find is that when these crackdowns occur, that they tend to produce immediate results. There is a reduction in the problem behavior, whether it's criminal behavior or other problem behaviors. But what happens is the crackdown is, by definition, short-term. It ends, and it isn't long, a couple weeks, maybe a couple months. The crime comes back. So these crackdowns can be really expensive. They require a lot of personnel. They require a lot of time. And again, unlike hotspots policing, they're not devoted to necessarily very specific locations and very specific crimes and times, but they're a little bit broader. And so the costs become overwhelming, and it's too difficult to sustain them for long periods of time. And so once we back off on the crackdown, then the crime returns after a while. So they aren't as effective as they often should be, but we see them. Maybe you've had them. Just think of like a DUI sobriety check, but we're going to crack down on DUIs, and so we're going to have checkpoints on this particular weekend. And so, okay, we reduce DUI for that weekend, but the next weekend when the police are gone, the checkpoints are gone, the DUIs may be back. So crackdowns don't seem to be as effective as hotspots policing when it's done really well. For guns and gang violence, your book profiles in particular what happened in Boston. Boston had a really successful program called Operation Ceasefire. And what they did was they really wanted to reduce gang violence. And so they took a really kind of a combination of problem-oriented policing, hotspots, community policing. They really merged a bunch of different styles of policing. And so what they did was they pulled together a team of local and federal law enforcement, and not just police and federal agents, but also the courts, the justice system, various agencies within the justice system. They really put together, in essence, a task force. So a team of various members of the justice system, the law enforcement community, even the private community, the private sphere and the community organizations. So they really tried to have this very broad approach and involve a lot of different organizations to attack the problem of youth gang violence. And so it wasn't all about arrest, because it wouldn't make sense if it was only about arrest. Why involve private and community organizations? But it involved a lot of different tactics. So they did use traditional law enforcement. They would bring in the Operation Ceasefire team if juvenile gangs used violence or intimidated people, but otherwise, if it was just, regular offenses being done by youth, then Operation Ceasefire didn't get involved. But if these were suspected gang members and maybe people who were at risk to become gang members, and they were involved in some kind of violent crime, some kind of gang-related crime, then there might be traditional law enforcement, but there are also other initiatives, such as community, educational, and employment programs. So this included anti-violence and youth outreach programs. So they brought in churches and community organizations and sports organizations and a whole bunch of different organizations to really take this broad community approach that didn't place all the responsibility on the police or law enforcement, but really spread it out to say, hey, we're all involved in this. We need, kind of like the principles of policing that said, the police and the community, the police are the community are the police. They need to share responsibilities. Let's come together to deal with this problem. And it appeared to be pretty successful. Gang violence really went down in Boston. It was employed in other cities, and many of those cities produced similar positive results. Sometimes they didn't. And so it was important to study those cities in which we didn't have a reduction in violence, or whether gang violence or gun violence. And so researchers found that probably the primary key to success, at least long-term success, was really effective planning at the beginning. So before you plunged into an Operation Ceasefire type endeavor, you really needed to plan it. You need to make sure that you had the various agencies on board with you. Were they really going to cooperate with you? Was the federal law enforcement going to cooperate with the local and state? Were the courts going to cooperate? Were the prosecutors going to be marching to the same beat? Were we going to share some common goals? Could we enlist the community organizations to help? Could we get enough funding for these programs, these educational programs, these employment programs, the anti-violence programs? Could we get in contact with the kids who were at risk? All of these kinds of things, you needed to do a whole lot of planning. And if you did that, then your chances for success were much greater. If you just jumped into it and said, okay, we're going to do the same thing that Boston did without planning it very well, you probably were doomed to failure. It wasn't going to work very well. Playing off of this, we found that success was sometimes just temporary because the planners didn't anticipate the long-term needs of these programs. So you can't just come in and basically run it like a crackdown, do it for a couple months, and then say, oh, we reduced gang violence, gun violence, we can pull the program, we don't need to do it anymore. No, you probably needed to develop it into a more long-term kind of initiative so that when you do get a control over if you're successful and you control the violence, then these other non-police programs can continue to play a role. So the anti-violence messages don't stop. The conditions that produce the gang violence in the beginning don't return because people are neglecting it. Because, we beat the problem and so it's over. No, you need to continue to monitor and make sure that you are regularly in these kids' lives. If you're going to focus on youth gang violence, that you are constantly promoting that positive message. You have positive avenues for success, for education, for employment, for those kinds of things. So it takes a long-term commitment if you want this to last. And many cities didn't make that plan, didn't do the planning for the long-term commitment. They did it for the short term, but not for the long term. And so after a while, the gang violence returned in many of these cities.